So we are back working on the Madnette, which is our 1957 MG Madnette body on top of a shortened S10 chassis. And today we are going to be installing our TRZ Motorsports steering rack conversion kit. So we picked up some relatively inexpensive, just stock upper and lower control arms from Amazon. It'll do just fine for this project here. And as always, we can put a link in the description for what we bought if you're interested in buying them for your project. So what I did when I took this apart, I stacked all the shims that came out of it right there so that when I throw it back together, we can start out with the same exact shims, and it should be at least as close to as it was before. So we'll go ahead and do the other side. Get the spindle in here. Then we can actually start moving forward with trying to figure out the steering. So we got everything bolted in place here. Of course, no springs, so we can move it through its motion. Now with the stock stuff, it's going to be a little harder running it through its motion than with, say, some tubular A-arms with rod ends, but we can still do it fine with this. And I went ahead and cleaned up the front of the cross member because we're going to have to mount it somewhere to there. But before we go any further with it, I need to do a bit of research on figuring out what our ride height is going to be and where this actually needs to be sitting, and do some brushing up on the installation of the kit before I actually jump into it. So the kit we got here includes the steering rack. It's got some tubing here for the steering shaft. Got 3 steering U-joints. One of them is splined for here and the rest of them are not, so they can be welded onto the shaft. We got the TRZ Hyman end, joints, which are your tie rod ends basically. All the mounts, a center support brace, and this one even includes the bump steer conversion kit. Hopefully his wife isn't watching because he went all out on this one. So the instructions on this thing isn't the clearest in the world if you've never done any of this kind of work, but it's also keeping it kind of simple. And there's a bit more to think about than what they are telling you if you're using it as a street car and not like a drag car. Because this is really set up if you're building a drag truck. It's simple, effective, and they put the steering rack pretty far forward to reduce the Ackermann effect quite a bit. And that's something we can talk about later. And there's very little information about where to place it other than just saying put it up as high as you can get it without hitting the oil pan, which for us is no big deal whatsoever because our engine is about 5 inches further back than where it would be in an S10, so we got plenty of actual room here to work with. But I guess the starting point here is going to be we need to drill out the spindles here in order to use the kit here. They kind of expect you to use aftermarket spindles. Now this is actually drop spindles, 2-inch drop spindles, but they still use standard tie rod ends. We have to drill these out to 1/2 inch in order to put these bolts through there to use this kit. So that's where we'll get started. This should be pretty obvious to anybody who's really worked on cars, but these are tapered for tie rod ends, and the holes are smaller than 1/2 inch, which is why we got to drill them out. So you could probably drill through either way, up or down. I'm thinking it probably centers up better coming up through this way. Might be a little harder on the drill bit though. Of course, the chuck on my drill is getting wore out now. It doesn't hold this stuff really well. So once you get that drilled through there, we start out with, and according to instructions, you start with it that way, and then we put one of those on there, and then this will be on there, and then we go ahead and put a nut and washer. Now I'll go ahead and see if I got some other nuts that are not lock nuts, because we're only doing this temporary and I don't want to use the lock nuts for it. But we'll get the other side done, and then we'll start bolting things together and figuring out where it's going to sit. So when you go to install a kit like this, you want to be sitting at your ride height as you're setting things up to be able to check things, and you don't want springs in there if you're going to actually run through the bump steer like you should. I have yet to see a video on YouTube where they're doing any of that, so hopefully this will be an informative video. Now, don't look at me as I'm like a total professional at this. This is the first time I've actually set up a steering rack like this on something. I've come from a racing background. My dad was extremely good at this stuff, but he didn't really teach me much of it. I know the basics, I just haven't really done it yet. So, but what I do is I do a lot of research to double check that I'm remembering everything correctly, because I don't trust my memory, and that I'm doing things right beyond what the instructions are telling us in the kit here. Now, the other thing you need to do is you need to make sure your rack is centered to start with. Now they have this thing marked here. There's a mark here and a mark here, and that should be the center as it comes out of the package, but I'd like to double check that. So we'll line this thing up with that notch, and then we can turn it all the way to one side. Let me say it's on this side of that notch. And I was actually a little bit, and then we can turn it back around. 1, 2, 3. So it's not quite a 4 turn, it's about 3 3/4 roughly. Now we're on the other side of that notch, which means that that notch is pretty darn close to center. I was looking at it earlier, it's just a fuzz off of being perfectly centered, but it is very, very close. But I like to double check that just to make sure. And then we need to put the tie rod ends on, which we gotta obviously. And what I'll do is I'll take a measurement from here to there of what I believe is pretty much straightforward, and then we'll set this at the same measurement as a starting point. Now, it took me a little bit to kind of figure out what our ride height actually was, because I wasn't expecting to do this just yet, and I thought I'd end up having this thing back on the ground and then figuring out the ride height. So what I ended up doing was bolting the front end back onto the car, putting the tires on here, and raising this up to where the wheel well gap was what we're figuring on we're going to have at our final ride height, to see what the angle of the A-arms are going to be. And then I've actually got some little bits of angle in here clamped in here to hold both of them at the same height as my starting point to start setting all of this up. Now, when we go to do this, we'll bolt this through here. This will go on the bottom, and we'll actually suspend it in between here, and it should hold pretty straight. And that's the starting point in the instructions for the kit. So in the instructions, they say mount it as high as you can get it and clear the oil pan. But then your rods here want to be at basically the same angle as the lower A-arms. Now, stock lower A-arms can lie to you a little bit, because you're actually looking at the pivot, from the pivot point to the ball joint, not what this line here is. So it's a lot easier to look at that with tubular A-arms than with stock ones. And we're not that far off right now, but we're obviously not going to be spacing it any further down. If anything, we might have to shave a little off of these and bring it up some, but we won't know until we do some playing around here and actually get the mounting where we want it. Now these brackets here would push it out a lot further forward. In order to go further forward without taking this out, it would absolutely have to go even higher than what it's sitting now. And as it is, if we ended up here, we might end up trimming this up a little bit. We were trying to keep this, since this is going to be a road-going car. This is 99% of this use of this car is going to be cruising on the road and enjoying it, not racing it or anything like that. So yeah, we will see a bit more wear on these than say a drag racer would, but that's the price you pay for trying to do this stuff. But of course this car won't be used like 10,000 miles a year or anything. It's just a fun cruiser. So we got some playing around here yet to figure out what we're going to do, because we also have to look at the steering shaft, where it's coming through here and where we can pick it up on the other side. But my understanding on all the suspension stuff is if you look at the width of the rack, if you feel in here, you can feel where the pivot point is of the inner tie rod end. The width of this inner tie rod end from here to here should fall within this line of your pivot point here and your pivot point here on your upper and lower A-arms. And these are obviously wider than your lower pivot points, so you don't want it level with that. That's why they tell you to put it higher up, because that puts this in a more optimum spot width-wise as you go higher with it. But in our case, at our ride height with these spindles and everything we got, that would definitely put us probably almost eliminating these spacers altogether. So we're going to stop right here and just talk a little bit about just geometry. Now, I am absolutely not going to claim to be the authority here. And the idea here is not to explain it all to you so that you understand it. It's more just to make you aware of it. There are lots of things to actually consider when installing a steering rack, more than just where does it fit and does it steer. There's a lot of different angles and geometry going on in a suspension, and the position of the rack, the ideal position can be in a lot of different places depending on a lot of different factors within the suspension. Now this particular suspension, the A-arms, the upper A-arms are both canted further out at the front at that angle, and the lower ones are just the opposite. Now, if you're doing a drag racing application or say road racing application, something like that, race car versus street car, they might be in line, parallel with each other, especially the bottom ones. And this all has to do with, ride compliance and stuff like anti-dive under braking, keeping the front end from diving down, various other things that manufacturers put in partly for packaging and partly for like ride compliance and stuff. And it may not be optimal for racing, or really isn't, but all those angles can affect various things like caster, which caster is, if you go through the straight angle of, like say the kingpin line or through the ball joints, if it's leaning back or forward, that is caster, and usually they're going to be leaning back. The more it leans back, the more it's going to self-center it when you let it go of the steering coming out of a corner. The more it's going to want to go back just straight all by itself. But then the heavier the steering is going to be in slow speeds. And then you have camber, which is the angle of the wheel. If it's tipped in towards, then that's negative camber. If it's tilted out, it's positive camber. And the swinging motions of this can change camber as it moves. And generally, like a lot of racing applications, you want it as it compresses to pull in and get camber gain as it compresses. But that's, like I said, we're not really talking about all of that stuff in detail here. It's more of a informational thing. Give you food for thought to think about and do your own research for your own needs. Now, what you're using the vehicle for is going to change your needs and what you want out of it. Drag racing applications versus say road racing or autocrossing, you're going to want different things out of your suspension. Now there's also a thing called Ackermann, or as some people say Ackermann angle. And that means as you turn the wheel, like say we're turning left, as you turn the wheel, the inside wheel will turn further than the outside wheel. And there's all kinds of, it's not easy to actually truly figure out and get that perfect, because it has to do with the angles. You're going to plot the angles out from both of them way out beside the car, somewhere out in there, based on, if I remember correctly, the polar center of the car, but I don't remember 100%. And that can take a lot of time and equipment to figure that out. But the one thing to know is, from the center line of the steering arm here, the further forward you pull the rack, the less Ackermann effect there's going to be. And the more you pull it back, the more Ackermann effect there's going to be. But there is a point when you're pulling it back with some suspensions, depending on what you have, that there could be a point at which you could end up with a steering that actually wants to lock at full turn if you're not careful. So whenever you do any of this stuff, you want to tack it all up and run it through its paces and full lock to lock and everything, and make sure you get no binding while you're doing it. A lot of drag cars will have it pulled way forward. Actually, way forward on a lot of cars. And that takes that out to where it's much more just even all the time, which is fine for a drag car, but you wouldn't want that autocrossing. Now on a street car here, like this, we're going to want something a little different than a drag racer. But now the biggest thing that you're going to talk about with these kits within all their paperwork and stuff is bump steer. Bump steer is as the suspension moves up and down. It's the relationship of the wheels. So if you take the wheels, you have them, if they're turned in, that's called toe in. If they're turned out, that's toe out. Now, most street applications, you're going to want them towed in a little bit. It's going to give you a little tire scrub. It's going to make the steering a lot more stable, especially down the freeway. Towing out a little bit would be more responsive steering, and you'd want that for like road racing. Now, bump steer means as the suspension moves up and down, and it works, what does that relationship do as it moves? Normally what it's going to do is at ride height, it'll be one thing, and as it compresses, it'll toe in a little bit. And as it goes out, and then as it droops, it'll toe in a little bit. Because of the arcs of swing of everything. Because you have a swing of the upper arm, lower arm, and of the rack. Now if you get the rack positioned height-wise, or get the width of the rack properly sized to where the pivot points here end up in line with the pivot points here, that can go a long way to reducing that and getting it to near zero. But if you can't get that, that's why you have all of this. So you're effectively changing the pivot point here a little bit to help compensate for that. And that's what they talk about most within the instructions in the kits, and that's why we have this. The characteristics that you want is going to depend on what you want for your car. What are you using it for? Because if you're setting it up for drag racing and you go out and you maybe you have a bit too much bump steer in it because you didn't get set up right, and you go out on the highway doing a drag and drive or something, you go over bumps in the highway, and then your steering is going to be just doing, you're going to be, you're not going to feel comfortable. So getting it right really is a big thing if you want the car to feel right while you're driving it. But we're not going to explain all those things. We're just making sure you understand that those things exist, and it's something to think about while you're doing it. Do your own research, or get in touch with somebody who can explain it to you and help you set it up properly.